the biggest disruptions that COVID-19 introduced was schooling. Schools were closed, laptops were open, and remote learning became routine in many households. Parents were thrust into new roles, students missed their friends, and social time became screen time. Parents were often overwhelmed balancing their work with new work of becoming substitute teachers at home. What was lost in terms of education for our children? What was gained in terms of lessons learned for the next time? And what did COVID reveal about problems and inequities that existed before the pandemic? Let's listen in on a conversation about that and more. We're joined now by Dr. Ashley Berner, a Cardus Senior Fellow and the Director of the Institute for Education Policy at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. And Dr. Deanie Van Pelt, President of Advanced Christian School Association, Senior Fellow at Cardus and Visiting Scholar at the University of Cumbria. Deanie and Ashley, I'm so delighted just to listen in on this conversation about education. So let's have a close look at it. With COVID's impact on schooling, what really got lost? What kind of learning losses were there, and how did it impact families today? Ashley, why don't you jump in?
Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be with you all at Cardus. I'm pleased to be part of it. So at our institute, we focus on the core things that schools can provide, namely a strong liberal arts curriculum or a robust curriculum and a strong school culture where all the stakeholders are aligned. And those are the two things that schools of any kind, whether it's a district school, a Catholic school, a Protestant school, an Islamic school, Jewish school, all schools can, as it were, pull those levers to advance students' learning and civic capabilities. So what COVID really showed us is the disparity between school systems that had put those in place and those that did not. And that's on the school side. Also showed us disparities in terms of what families need by way of support. There were well-resourced families that could pick right up and give their kids tutors or put them in a private school that stayed open when maybe the district school didn't, and other families who didn't even have access to the internet. So I would say the learning loss itself has not really been adequately measured yet, but we know it's significant. I would really say the real loss is actually it's somewhat of a wake-up call to schools and also to our society about the inequities that really pertain.
Deanie, 16 months of disruption in education in Canada. What really happened?
Yes, indeed. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me. Great to be here with you as well, Ashley, tonight. I have had a front row seat to a small sector of independent schools in Ontario. And while many in other systems lost months of schooling, our analysis and our study of that sector of schools, so again, it's a small sector representing 15,000 students, up to half of them did not lose a single day of instruction with the pivot to remote learning. Were these schools well-heeled? Is it wealth? Is it some kind of extraordinary income or cash sitting around that explains it? Absolutely not. These are small, autonomously run, independent schools where the parents are known to the teachers, work with the teachers, and the teachers canceled March break, pivoted to design their classes, and within a few days after the March break, they were able to be up and running. So we know it's possible for schools to not lose instruction. We know it's possible for schools to stay in touch with kids. These are schools that they educate at about $9,000 per student. So yes, that's a lot of money for some families, but when you look at that cost overall, it's not a $49,000 price tag to attend a school where education wasn't interrupted. Why is this important? It tells a story that it's possible in times of crisis for excellent education to continue to happen. And I think the hopeful story coming out of this is that if we pay a little bit of attention to what happened in those circumstances, we've got some insight as to what can happen in all circumstances. What are the keys? And I think there are two keys which I'd be happy to talk about.
I want to dig deeper, a little bit more into the disruption side of this, and then maybe we can have some further conversation on how we can exit COVID in the educational systems. Tell me about digital technology and our ability to integrate that with no notice at all. Were we successful? Deanie, I noticed your kind of reference in the pandemic pivot paper that there was some reasonable success, but I'm not sure parents are all on track with that kind of assessment. What have we learned there, and what really actually happened?
Me? I
ahead,
would say
Ashley. You bet.
in the States, there's, I mean, again, this notion of the disparities, the schools that went into the crisis with really great curricula that the teachers were prepared to teach, in many cases had online lessons too. That was an easier shift. The schools that had a strong school culture, where the parents, like as Deanie was saying, everyone is there's a shared mission, there's a shared vocabulary, there's a known, their children feel known. And we've seen these differences across every school sector. Those schools fared better. I would say the fact is we still have digital deserts in our country. Every state has a rural community that is not well connected. And that's where there was a real crisis, because no matter how great the curriculum was or wasn't, teachers were having to photocopy it, distribute it to families were having pickups. That was the first problem. This very real issue of a digital desert. And there are philanthropies that are stepping in to try to address that. So, that's the one problem, is just capacity. And on the other hand, the kids who are used to being social, the more extroverted kids, really have been harmed by the constant online, digital approach. There's been a rise in teen suicides and teen, eating disorders, and we just don't know what the consequences of going fully remote have been yet. But we know there's been a cost there, even where the digital quotes pivot was successful. So
I think Ashley, I think you're right on. We can't minimize the awful losses that happened, learning losses. And I'm so excited about the work you're doing, talking about not only like remediation, but you've got some really exciting plans that I think I've caught wind of about really accelerating learning. And I think we can't minimize the losses that have happened socially or academically. But I think for me, the hope is knowing that in those places, as you say, where there might have even been a digital desert, parents work together with teachers, and there were package pickups that happened on a very regular basis. People pitched in. The board of governors of a school suddenly moved from more of a governance mode to I guess we'll roll up our sleeves as well. It was like, and the staff, had to be laid off in these schools. So it's not even like they increased the staffing. There was no government funding from the province for any of these schools towards any of the costs of the health and safety measures. They just came together as a community, and they were able to weather a crisis. And now throughout this past year, we've seen that I've heard that homeschooling in Canada has doubled. Official homeschooling, however we define official homeschooling, has doubled. And the schools that I studied, we noticed that 70% of them had at least a 10% increase in enrollment. So as things are settling down, parents are looking beyond the state for the education of their kids. And so they saw that early pivot, the well-being, then they're moving to something else. But again, I don't see that has to be the answer. Sure, possibly that's what worked now, because state did, as one of our earlier panelists said, have a limited capacity to respond in a time of crisis. But I think the hope here, and Ashley, you're going to be a big part of that solution, is that going forward, all education sectors can embrace these best ideas and these best practices of how to surround kids with the best education possible. One of the things we found is smaller schools do matter. And let's not be afraid to design small schools, but let's tap them into larger systems of accountability and support and master teaching and excellent curriculum so that each little school isn't left in isolation. But small does matter, particularly at the elementary level. We're so interested in talking about class size, and I'm thankful to see smaller cohorts, etc. But let's talk school size. That's where community is, and that's where the health and the happiness happens, even in times of crisis. But I think going forward, that's where it'll be in times of innovation.
I would actually second that the school systems that were able to be very creative with their teaching force and actually design very personalized responses. So one large school system in North Carolina, actually, Guilford County, last summer, took their master teachers, the teachers who were absolutely prima and practiced with content mastery and delivery, and they taped a bunch of lessons that were then deployed in the fall. And the master teachers played the role of, high level instruction, and then other teachers and para teachers and so forth were tasked with keeping kids in little micro communities. Whether virtual or in person, that held them together in a social and moral and academic framework. So those are the kinds of creative things that can really help in these situations and going forward.
I'm struck by your conversation on really two fronts. Number one, I'm thinking about the parents. I have to kind of note, as an observer of COVID-19, March 12th comes along and all of a sudden parents become educators. Against their will. What possibilities does that have for the future? What might we have learned by that? And Ashley, I can't help but think of some of the work that you've done on education pluralism, and Dini, the work you've done on educational diversity here in Canada. Does COVID-19's impact on the disruption of education create new possibilities for both of these fronts? I'm really, really interested in that. And how long will it take for that to happen?
It certainly, yes, it has. You're absolutely right. There have been real disruptions that I would favor, in the end, that have, multiple states have passed an expansion of tax credits and educational savings accounts and expanded vouchers and so forth. And I think that's quite good. I don't think we can let go of the need for public accountability and quality, because I can tell you, working in every school sector, from the standpoint of providing services and advice to them, there's such variability in the quality in every school sector between schools, and this is something we can all work on together by strengthening all kinds of schools to deliver excellent education, instruction, and also a really robust community.
I think it's such an important question. What is the role of parents? And we all know, our governments knew in their hearts, parents are the primary educators. Parents have the primary responsibility. We know that. Nature tells us that. And we've actually lived that in the last year. When there was a crisis, go home, kids. And so we know that, and we know that that's baked into the various UN statements on the rights of the child, statements on the primacy of parents as primary educators and have the primary right to make decisions about their kids' education. So we've just all had a great experiential opportunity to embrace that philosophical understanding that we all kind of know deep in our hearts. So I think we should live into that, and that is indeed the second thing that I would want to say. When we're designing these interestingly autonomous schools, small but connected into these larger networks and supports, let's think about how can we better embrace the role of parents going forward? Again, regardless of system, parents care so deeply for their kids and want what's best for their kids. Every parent does. We embrace that in so many of our other systems in the social work programs, and parents first. And that's what we should really be working on. And that's a huge place of hope going forward as we redesign our education systems going forward to embrace more technology, more interesting school design and delivery of excellent education.
You know, I can't help, just as we kind of close this conversation, asking you, is it political solutions that we're looking for here? Is it cultural solutions that we're looking for here? Maybe a bit of both, but just as we close, give me a quick sense. Ashley, we'll start with you. How much politics do we need to happen here, and government and legislation to reform education? And how much do we need cultural change, and maybe change even within parents and families toward education flourishing?
So I think there's definitely the need for bipartisan political action where stakeholders and policymakers from across the political spectrum can come together and say, let's enable all distinctive schools that really reflect parents' needs and values and that are also accountable to the public for the common good. So we need bipartisan compromise, and it's wonderful when this happens, and it can still happen. That's the first thing. In this country, in my country, the cultural shift is often around instruction. It's hard for someone who doesn't live in the States to understand this, but the United States historically under challenges our kids intellectually. And this is true across all the sectors. There are always very elite prep schools that are high, intellectual challenge on steroids, sometimes too much so that it can harm kids, but the vast majority under challenges. So now is the time to step up, to not remediate, but to accelerate learning. And that's my hope.
Deanie, 30 seconds, politics or culture?
It's a fabulous question. Is it policy? Is it philosophy is the way I'd say it. And I love both. I think policy can set the groundwork for allowing the flourishing, the innovation, and diverse philosophical approaches to education to be designed and delivered. But we need good policy settings. And if we have a heavy burden and the barriers to entry with diverse options in education are so heavy, it will diminish the creativity of those of us that are ready to go to bring communities together and design and build beautiful education spaces. We need both good policy and amazing folks dialed into the big questions of education.
Deanie, thank you very much. Ashley, great conversation. I look forward to having many more of those in the future. Thank you very much.